People always say that war steals everything: time, peace, youth. But there are things even war can't bury, not in ashes, not in silence. The morning Gerald turned 93, he sat on the same wooden bench by the sea where he'd sat every Sunday for over 50 years, watching the waves rise and fall like they had something to say. In his weathered hands, he held a letter. The paper was thin, yellowed, a bit torn in one corner, but it smelled faintly of lavender and iron ink. Strangers passed by him every day, never stopping, never knowing. But inside Gerald's coat pocket was a secret that had survived not just the weight of time, but the fire of a world broken in half. That day, for the first time in decades, he was finally ready to tell the truth, not to a newspaper, not to his children, but to her. Because there are promises that don't fade, not when they're carved into the soul, not even when the world forgets, and this one had waited long enough. What does it mean to wait for something your entire life? And what happens to a promise when only one person survives to remember it? Most people would say it's foolish to carry a vow made in a foxhole all the way into old age. But Gerald knew better. A promise isn't about timing, it's about weight. The heavier it is, the more it anchors you to who you used to be. And in that weight, you find the shape of the person you once loved, and maybe still do, even if no one else remembers her name, even if the world moved on, because some memories don't ask for permission to stay. They just do. In 1941, Gerald was barely 18 and carried nothing but a duffel bag, a ration book, and a photograph of a girl he'd only known for 6 weeks. Her name was Anneliese. She was 17, half Austrian, with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that made even the birds stop singing to listen. They met in a library bombed 2 days later. The floor had cracked open like a mouth, swallowing shelves and windows, but they had survived, pressed together under a marble statue of Goethe, as if poetry itself had shielded them. It was the kind of meeting that should have never lasted more than a moment. But in those ruins, something deeper grew, a quiet, stubborn hope. For weeks they walked among the debris of Vienna, sharing stories in half-whispers and writing letters they never knew if they'd have the chance to send. Anneliese taught him German curses and poems in the same breath. She'd say, "If we're going to be afraid, we might as well laugh while we do it." And he'd laugh, even if the air around them always tasted of dust and diesel. There were air raids, curfews, rumors of disappearances, but in the eye of all that terror, they built a fragile world of their own, a world made of candlelight in basements, stolen apples, and fingers interlaced under fraying coats. They made a pact. If they survived, they'd find each other after the war, no matter the cost. "Write to this address," she whispered one night, shoving a folded note into his hand, as sirens screamed in the distance. "Even if I'm gone, my soul will wait there for you." The day he left Vienna, it snowed, not heavy but soft, like the sky wanted to cushion the goodbye. Gerald remembered the exact way her lips trembled when she kissed him at the train station. He remembered because he never kissed anyone quite like that again. He never even tried. The war took him to France, then Italy, then Germany again, but never back to her. Letters stopped coming, addresses changed, names vanished from lists. He searched every time they stopped in a new town, asking about a girl with stormy eyes and poetry in her breath. No one ever said they saw her, but still, he carried her letter everywhere he went. A folded piece of paper that had become more than ink and words. It was his anchor, his compass, his reason to come home. After the war, Gerald returned to England, rebuilt what was left of his life, and buried the rest. He married a woman named Claire. They had 2 children. He became a carpenter, built homes with his hands, taught his son how to carve birds from oak. But every time he touched a chisel, he thought of the way Anneliese used to trace poetry on his palm. Claire died young, cancer. And when she did, Gerald felt an emptiness return, not because he didn't love her, but because the silence in his chest echoed more loudly than before. He never told anyone about Anneliese, not even on his loneliest days. Some love stories aren't meant to be shared. They're meant to be kept warm inside, like coals under snow, waiting for the right wind to burn again. Now, at 93, The world around him had changed beyond recognition. The sea was still there. The bench was still there. But the buildings were newer, the faces younger, the language faster. Gerald didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that memories don't compete with reality. They just exist beside it, quietly. And today, he wasn't there to remember. He was there to find something. Because last week, for the first time in decades, someone had mailed him a letter. The handwriting matched hers. The scent, too. Lavender and iron. No return address. Just a single line. I kept my promise. Did you? He didn't sleep for days after that. Couldn't eat. Couldn't think. Only one question bloomed in his chest like a secret garden. Was she still alive? And if she was, had she waited too? The snow outside the window melted slowly, leaving small silver rivers across the glass. Gerald hadn't left Anneliese's side since he arrived. He refused to waste a single second. She dozed off often, her body now fragile, movements slow. But every time her eyes opened and they found his, there was that flicker. Recognition, memory, love. That last word they hadn't spoken yet, but it hovered between them like something holy, something still alive. Anneliese's room was small but quiet, the kind of quiet you only get after surviving too much noise. There were paintings on the wall, some clearly done by other residents, childlike in color but heavy in feeling. A vase with purple crocuses stood by the window. Gerald noticed the way she always looked at them when she woke up. "They only bloom for a short while," she whispered once, watching the petals with her chin resting in her hand. Then they disappear, without making a fuss. He wanted to tell her that she wasn't a flower. She was a lighthouse, something that withstood storms. But words like that always felt too heavy to say aloud. One morning, he brought her a photograph. It was the only surviving picture of them together, taken in Vienna behind the ruins of that library. Dust on their faces, but their smiles were full and unafraid. Anneliese held it gently, as though it might vanish in her fingers. "I forgot what we looked like then," she said, almost to herself. "I thought I'd imagined this face." Gerald chuckled, brushing a loose hair from her cheek. "I never did," he said. "Every time I hammered a nail, every time I shaved, every time I looked at my reflection, I saw you there." Over the following days, Gerald learned everything he'd never dared to imagine. Anneliese had spent years moving from city to city after the war, searching for him in her own way. She even traveled to London once in 1954, following a rumor about an English carpenter who worked near a harbor, but she didn't know his last name, just Gerald, and she never found him. She'd finally stopped searching after a stroke stole her ability to walk properly. That's when she moved to Salzburg, into the quiet of a life reduced to books, letters to no one, and old songs. He never asked why she waited. Some things didn't need to be said, but what puzzled him most wasn't her loyalty. It was the letter, the one that had led him here. She claimed she hadn't sent it, at least not recently. "I wrote you letters, yes, but not this year. I can't write anymore, Gerald." Her hand trembled as she showed him her fingers, now stiff, curled slightly inwards. "Someone must have found my things. Maybe it was luck." But Gerald didn't believe in luck. Not like this. Someone had sent that letter on purpose, someone who knew exactly what it would awaken. 2 days later, while helping Anneliese clean out an old chest, Gerald found it. A stack of her unsent letters, all written decades ago, some addressed to his old barracks, others to addresses that no longer existed. Among them was a note in unfamiliar handwriting, slipped inside an envelope postmarked just weeks earlier. "She spoke your name every day," it read. "She remembered your voice. She deserved to be found." It wasn't signed, but tucked in with the note was a Polaroid, a young nurse in her 20s, standing beside Anneliese, smiling. Her badge read Margaret Weiss, Margaret, her niece. She had been living nearby, visiting often, sorting through her aunt's drawers. Somehow, in reading the old letters, she'd pieced the story together. She'd sent the letter herself, hoping that whoever Gerald was, wherever he was, he'd still be alive, and still be looking. That night, Gerald sat outside the care home, the cold air stinging his cheeks. He looked up at the stars, blinking away tears. He hadn't believed in fate, but now it felt like something larger had nudged things back into place. He whispered a quiet thank you to Margaret, to the nurse who believed in fairy tales and love letters, to the years that hadn't broken him, and to the woman upstairs who had never let go of a promise, even when the world told her to forget. The next morning, Anneliese was sitting upright in her chair, brighter than usual. She smiled as he walked in. "I had a dream," she said. "You and I, back in Vienna, but this time, no bombs, just music, and we danced." He nodded. "Maybe someday we will." Her eyes gleamed. "Not someday," she said. "Now." They arranged for a small dance in the courtyard of the care home. A few nurses helped move furniture aside. Someone found an old gramophone. As the first notes of a slow waltz crackled into the cold afternoon, Gerald stood and offered his hand. Anneliese rose, shaky but standing, supported by his arms. They didn't move much, just swayed in place, but to everyone watching, it was the most graceful thing they'd ever seen. Winter passed slowly after that. Gerald extended his stay indefinitely. He moved into a small rented flat near the home, visiting Anneliese every morning and every evening. Sometimes they sat in silence, her head on his shoulder, the clock ticking softly in the background. Sometimes they told the same stories, laughed at the same memories. Other times she would forget where she was, or who he was. But when that happened, he'd hold her hand and wait until she returned to him. But time isn't kind, even to those who waited a lifetime. One evening, she didn't open her eyes. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cool. Gerald sat beside her for hours, holding her hand as her chest rose and fell like a tide growing smaller. "It's all right," he whispered. "You kept your promise. I'm here." She squeezed his hand once, faintly, then slipped away, her last breath as soft as the air before snowfall. The care home grew quieter after that. The nurses moved gently around him, eyes filled with sympathy but giving him space. He didn't cry. Not yet. He just sat with her a little longer, brushing the hair from her forehead, the way he always had. When he finally stood, he took the crocus from the windowsill and tucked it into the pocket over his heart. The funeral was small. A few staff, some residents, and Margaret, who stood beside him the entire time. She handed him an envelope. "She wrote this last week," she said. "Said you were never to read it unless—" She trailed off. Gerald nodded and opened it slowly. It was written shakily, but with intent. "My dear Gerald, if you're reading this, then I've gone where I hope the air is kinder and time is more generous. I don't regret a single year we missed, because in those years I believed that you were alive, that you remembered, that you still loved me, and you did. That's enough for a lifetime. Promise me one thing now. Live, laugh, fall in love again, if your heart lets you. And if not, keep dancing, even if no music plays. Forever yours, Anneliese." Gerald cried then, not because she was gone, but because she had given him something no one else ever had, the right to start again. He returned to England a month later. His house felt emptier, quieter than ever before. But he didn't fall into silence. He began building again. Small things, toys for local children, a rocking chair for his daughter, birdhouses for his neighbor's garden. He painted each one with poetry. German phrases Anneliese used to whisper, carved gently into the wood. And sometimes, when the breeze picked up and carried the scent of lavender from his backyard, Gerald would close his eyes and feel her arms around him again, the weight of a promise kept. In his final years, he taught his great-grandson how to carve. "Every piece tells a story," he'd say. "The trick is listening before you start cutting." And when he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, he was buried with a letter in his hand and a single crocus laid across his chest. Some promises are broken by time, others bend, stretch, wait in silence. But the rarest ones, they survive everything. Margaret stood by the window of Gerald's old cottage, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the wind stir the trees in the garden he had once built with such care. The crocuses were blooming again, purple and bright and fragile, just like Anneliese had loved them. It had been 6 months since Gerald passed, but the house didn't feel empty. It felt paused, like it was waiting for something, or someone, to keep the story moving. She had come back to England to sort through his belongings, but every drawer she opened, every shelf she dusted, seemed to whisper fragments of the life he'd led. The war medals stored in a biscuit tin, dozens of birdhouses lined on the garage wall, and letters, so many of them, some addressed but never sent, others signed, "Yours always, A." On the kitchen table sat a wooden box, small and worn, with a faded ribbon tied around it. Inside, Margaret found a notebook. The pages were filled with Gerald's handwriting, neat, deliberate, emotional. It wasn't a diary, it was a story, their story, the entire love he and Anneliese had lived and lost, and then miraculously found again, written in careful detail, as though he feared the world might forget. At the end of the last page, there was a message. For Margaret. You brought me home to her. Thank you. Finish this if you can, so people remember we were here. She spent the rest of the evening reading it aloud in the silence of the cottage. Her voice trembled often, sometimes breaking entirely, but she read it through, all the way to the last word, her tears soaking into the paper. When she closed the notebook, she made a decision. A month later, the first video went live on a small YouTube channel called Second Chances. It opened with soft piano music and the words, "This is a true story of love that survived war, distance, silence, and time. My uncle Gerald waited a lifetime to keep a promise, and this is how he did it." Margaret told their story with tenderness and care, reading excerpts from the notebook, sharing photos, old letters, even a short clip of Gerald and Anneliese dancing slowly in the courtyard, wrapped in each other like they had never been apart. The response was immediate, thousands of comments, people from all over the world saying they cried, that they believed in love again, that it reminded them of someone they once loved or lost or still dreamed of. And something else began to happen. Letters started arriving at her door, handwritten, folded, personal, some from men in their 90s, sharing stories of girls they met during the war and never found again. Others from women who had waited years for someone to return. Children of those couples sent photographs, asking if Margaret could help them piece together their family's untold love stories. A woman in Belgium sent a black and white picture of her grandmother holding hands with a British soldier. No name, just the words "Spring 1944" scribbled on the back. Another, from Argentina, said her grandfather never stopped talking about a girl named Elise from Vienna. No last name, no address, just a memory that haunted his final days. Margaret realized what Gerald had asked of her wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about uncovering what war had buried, not bodies, but feelings, stories, love left unfinished. She created a series from his notebook. Each video focused on a different part of his and Anneliese's life: the library bombing, their first kiss, the letters that never arrived, the final reunion. And at the end of every video, she read a letter from someone else, someone still hoping to be found. Then one night, a message appeared in her inbox. The subject line read, "I think the woman in your story might be my aunt." Attached was a photo. It showed a young Anneliese standing beside a man who wasn't Gerald. The email went on to explain that Anneliese had once lived with her sister's family in Salzburg before the stroke. She told them she had been in love with an English soldier, but they'd all assumed it was a fantasy, something made up to fill the silence. But after watching the videos, they began to believe. Margaret met them in Salzburg that spring. They brought with them a small trunk filled with Anneliese's belongings, books, letters, even a faded scarf Gerald had once given her, still folded neatly in the corner. Together they visited her grave. Margaret placed a fresh crocus on the stone and whispered, "He found you. You both made it." Months passed and the channel grew, but Margaret never let it become something big or polished. She kept it simple, honest, real, the way Gerald had been, the way Anneliese had written. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat once more in his garden, notebook in her lap, and read aloud the final words he had ever written. "I loved her through silence, through distance, through war. And in the end, she loved me back, not because we had time, but because we never stopped believing that we would." Did you enjoy this story? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Enjoy and comment below about your experience listening to this story.